All right. We are rolling.
Great.
Okay, so just starting off, I mean, we're going back to when you were first elected, where you started with the sex party. I mean, you've had great success in the past year with the MSIC bill and the euthanasia. You've been very emotionally and politically involved in.
Yes.
Are those two issues that you had a connection with before you came into politics, or are they things that you've just naturally sort of gravitated towards?
No, they were definitely assisted dying and drug law reform were really two of my very major platforms. And I suppose being born initially out of a civil libertarian movement and a civil libertarian party, the notion that people should have greater autonomy over their lives is a basic tenet that we formed the party on. So of course, people having greater control over end-of-life choices and people having greater control over personal consensual drug use.
So I guess, can you tell me why you believe having the centre is so important? At certain points, I guess it didn't look like it was going to be successful.
Supervised injecting centres and I think more broadly looking at drug use and particularly drug misuse and problematic drug use as a health issue is fundamental, and the evidence shows that if you want to reduce harm in society, if you want to keep people alive, then that's the avenue that you must take. We have seen, and I actually was living in King's Cross when the centre opened up there. I lost many friends. I've lost friends and family to accidental drug overdoses. So yeah, it was personal, but the evidence was indisputable that a centre like that could save lives. And we've seen an increase in drug overdoses in Victoria. We're seeing the scourge of opioid use in the United States, where we're seeing opioids being swapped for things like carfentanil and fentanyl. So that wave of dangerous opioid use is nearly on our shores, and I certainly saw that the centre was absolutely crucial to happen in Victoria. And it wasn't just me, it was the traders in Richmond, it was the residents in Richmond, where 26 people died in a 12-month period in a 300 square metre area. Like, that is a crisis.
Yeah, and I think a common theme a lot of people I've spoken to about the MSIC, both in Melbourne and in Darlinghurst, is a personal connection at some point to what's happened. So whether it be a part of their community or within their family. So you just sort of mentioned before that you have a personal connection with it. Can you go into that anymore?
Look, I had an ex-boyfriend who died from an overdose. No doubt, if he had been somewhere safer, he wouldn't have. I had family members that didn't die, gratefully, and they're with us today. But certainly, had people not been around, if people hadn't been around, they most certainly would have come to a tragic end. And in those overdose circumstances, it was the fact that they were with people who could help them that saved their lives. And that's what a supervised injecting centre is about. The other thing that is really important is, and also my experience with friends and growing up, is that quite often when people go down a path of addiction or problematic use, they find it incredibly isolating. It means that they lose contact with family and friends. It means they lose the sort of social structures and social safety nets that they had grown up with and that they had. And so these are people who are incredibly vulnerable, and providing a supervised injection centre space provides a little bit of a safety net, not just so that they don't overdose when they use the drugs that they've brought with them, but that we can connect them with housing assistance, with legal assistance, with primary health assistance, with allied health assistance, that you can start showing that actually there's people who care
Yeah.
and want to see you alive.
Were you a user at any point?
I've been a recreational user of drugs, well, for quite a while. Yeah, and also, I mean, I was a volunteer on some of the first needle exchange programs in the ACT.
Okay.
That was when Australia was brave in harm minimisation. We were the first country to go, you know what? If people are using drugs and they're sharing needles, we need to be practical. We can say, stop using drugs, or we can say, here's a clean needle. And, in many ways, the centre's a logical next step there. So not, here's a clean needle and good luck to you out there in the alley, wherever you may go. Here's a clean needle and we'll make sure that you're okay when you use those drugs we know you're going to use.
When did we stop being courageous?
Look, I think certainly it was in the late 90s. I think John Howard really changed things. We had very progressive health ministers from both sides of government. We had drug policy that was progressive. We were almost looking at doing some heroin trials, prescription heroin trials in the ACT. We were seriously looking at decriminalisation. And we were seeing states, the ACT, South Australia, Northern Territory, all went to a kind of decriminalised or civil system for the personal growth of cannabis and the personal use of cannabis. We started seeing serious conversations in Victoria, New South Wales, around the decriminalisation of particularly cannabis, but also ecstasy. And that all fell by the wayside. Our approach to drugs fell by the wayside. We went back to a just say no approach. The money that had gone into progressive research was lost. We put, and possibly one of the slight positives, but it wasn't at the time, is while we were closing down all of our mental health institutions, we were putting a lot of that drug money into mental health, and now, and even then, we knew that the link between drug use and mental health was important to recognise. However, we really haven't clawed back the responsive, compassionate and progressive approach to drugs that we had in the 90s.
How, I know this is a very hard thing to quantify, but how far back has that placed us, do you think, since we were proactively working towards a better spot?
It's interesting listening to the news this morning and hearing the Opposition Attorney General, saying, well, if anybody breaks their parole, then they'll get locked back up again, and this kind of law and order fight to the bottom that the major parties are undertaking, not just here but everywhere else, shows that we have got so much to catch up on. I mean, you look at the United States, where the adult use of cannabis is being legalised in numerous states. I think we're up to 9 states now. 28 states have legalised the use of medicinal cannabis. States like Texas, which their whole economy really probably ran on their prison system, has closed down 8 prisons because they know locking people up, particularly for drug use, is actually not beneficial to the drug user, not beneficial to the society, nor is it beneficial to their bottom line. New York State now, I think, has the lowest crime rate in the United States, and it has been systematically closing down its jails. And what are we doing? We're building new ones. So Australia has fallen behind, where we were leaders in harm minimisation, in good drug strategies. we're now going back to policies that are from the last century, and most other countries have moved on from.
So, sorry, I'm just going to...
Yeah.
So you come into the council in 2014, and this is what you see, and this is what you're presented with. How do you go about it? I know you're a big advocate for concession within Parliament instead of standing directly by.
Yeah, look, I think I was pretty fortunate, I have to say, in that the makeup of the upper house meant that the government needed to work with the crossbench to pass anything. Now, I'm not of a mind for horse trading, but that creates a need for communication, a need to speak to me and to speak to my other colleagues. So that creates a level, a requirement for cooperation. So that really did help. And, the Andrews government has been relatively progressive, not in all areas, and I've probably opposed more legislation than I have supported, but I haven't opposed legislation just to oppose it. I've opposed it because it is against my existing platform or policies. But yeah, maybe it was out of naivety. I didn't know that that people weren't supposed to put up private members' bills and initiate committees and initiate inquiries and do what I did before, which was act as a lobbyist, and I've seen my role to continue to be an advocate and a lobbyist, albeit with far greater entree into ministers' offices than I ever had before, and a much bigger black book than I had before.
So I was surprised because we've been working on this project for a little while, and we had it all sort of frameworked out to wake up one morning and have a press conference in Richmond announcing that this was going ahead.
Yeah.
That was a pretty stark turnaround.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it surprised a lot of people.
Did it surprise you?
Look, that was my intention to get that to get a supervised injecting centre up. Now I had two different strategies on how I was going to do that, and probably I didn't think that I would get the turnaround and then support from the Premier that I did. However, when Miss A died in November 2006, when the Coroner's Court investigated Miss A's death in 2016, we knew that we couldn't wait until the recommendations from our drugs inquiry. One of the suggestions was that we ran a trial to provide live data, which would have been a very innovative way of looking at a drugs inquiry. And that was one angle that we were looking at. But in November 2016, when we saw...
Sorry, Fiona, can I just stop you there for a second?
Yeah.
Unfortunately. I might just go over on this.
Working for you?
Yeah, that's better.
Great. Anyway, look, I have to say I was very pleased that the Premier changed his position on this. I think it actually takes it really shows quite a statesman who can change their mind. Most can't. Once they've made that public statement, there's no going back. So I think that's pretty impressive that a Premier can do that. When I knew that the Coroner's Court was investigating the 26th death in 12 months, of a woman in North Richmond. I knew enough was enough, that the community was gathering, the momentum was starting, and we really needed to push this now and really engage with that growing momentum. So, like we would do with any campaign, we mobilised we mobilised at a grassroots level, but we also talked to the doctors, the nurses, the emergency service operators, the experts, and and the media. And the media was remarkable. They got it. So even the Herald Sun understood that this made sense. So come early February, come the opening of Parliament, I had drafted a bill. I had got 48 different agencies, including the Salvation Army, including the Australian Medical Association, the Royal College of Physicians, the ambulance drivers, the firefighters, had got all of them openly, publicly calling for a supervised injecting centre trial in North Richmond. And we kept mounting that. I couldn't get the government and I couldn't get the police. Although the first meeting I had in January in 2016 was with the Commissioner. And I went to speak to him and said, this is what I'm doing, and where do you sit on it? It was a good meeting, but he couldn't say anything publicly. Sure. So the bill was looking difficult. I knew privately I had an enormous amount of support in the Parliament. While I couldn't get it through, I got an agreement for a quick inquiry, upper house inquiry. That was difficult because there were some people on that committee who were absolutely opposed to any form of harm minimisation, completely. But it was a very good inquiry. It showed people around. People got to see firsthand what was going on. They also got to see firsthand what went on in Sydney, and that this wasn't glamorising drugs. This wasn't, helping kids to have their first drug experiences. This was helping some of the most marginalised people in our society stay alive.
Can I just ask you there, because I'm also quite interested sort of delving into the psyche of this very staunchly opposed vision of drug policy. So I'm going to take a stab in the dark and say that who you may have been alluding to just then was Inga.
Yeah.
Being on the committee with Inga Powlich, when did Inga go up to Darlinghurst?
No, of course not.
No. So
did she come on the tour of North Richmond? Of course not.
No. So what did the conversations consist with Inga, and where were her brick walls, where if you'd be talking about something or anything that you weren't going to break through it? And I'm guessing after that amount of time sitting on a committee with Inga, you sort of knew what those boundaries were. Can you explain to me where they sat and why you think they're so cemented into not moving?
She would argue, there was possibly some personal animosity on this issue.
You guys had a character clash a bit.
Correct. Yeah. And this had really started to come out during the End of Life Choices inquiry, which was the same committee. But with drug law reform, her position, while she'll talk to anyone while having a fag and drinking a pint, her position is that we haven't had a war on drugs, that this hasn't been a war on drugs. If you think this is a war, you haven't seen a war. We have not been tough on drugs. We have not stopped people using drugs. She would probably say that she could never come up with a solution, and no matter how you asked, well, what would you do differently? But the only thing I could possibly glean is that she would probably say that people should be compulsorily detained if they use drugs.
found with any quantity of drugs.
Any quantity, or found to be using, even if they or found under the influence of an illicit drug, that they should be detained and remanded into compulsory treatment.
Right.
Now, this is someone who...
That's quite a serious line.
It's a very serious line. It's also a very expensive line. And from someone who's escaping, who talks quite often about escaping from a fascist country and a fascist state, to be suggesting this type of draconian approach was really something quite astounding. But the Just Say No to Drugs approach is about as far as they think. You know, they also, Ms. Powledge would also indicate that there was a huge conspiracy going on, that that I had somehow, you know, hoodwinked a range of people, including the coroner, into thinking my way, that this was some bolshy socialist agenda, that again, that somehow the AMA and the Royal College of Physicians and that centre of redness, the Pharmacy Guild, had somehow been misunderstood and had supported it. So there was no evidence. There was no one even putting up evidence against the injecting centre, with the exception of Drug Free Australia and the Australian Christian Lobby. Those were the only two allies that she could find. So you'd have to say it was personality rather than, it certainly wasn't based on evidence.
No. How much of it as well, because I actually spoke to one of the researchers from Drug Free Australia.
Oh, yes.
I interviewed him a while ago, and you could tell quite evidently, I think, through 95% of the questions that I put to him, that there's also no personal exposure or personal experience to, at a minimum, drug use, and at the other end, dealt with anyone in their lives. I'm making a huge assumption. But there was just not that nuanced understanding of addiction or drug use at any level outside of quantified data that they seem to have rejigged to fit their own.
I know.
But how much?
It was remarkable. They without the budget, without the expertise, without the knowledge, they were able to counter KPMG and numerous other studies and point out all of their failings.
Able to use KPMG's data to completely come up with a separate conclusion that KPMG came up with in that.
Yes.
In that research project. So
yeah.
It's fascinating.
It was fascinating.
But enough of liberal truths. How important do you think it is in terms of an understanding at a basic level of drug policy, just the nuances of drug use that Miss Powledge, I don't think from any interaction I've had with her, has. And I think that's an important thing to understand if you're going to create any sort of well operating policy around the issue.
Yeah, look, I would love to. I'd love to agree with you and say that it was just her naivety, and that if she had understood drug policy, if she had experienced drug use, or that she had experienced a family member with a problematic drug use, that would have changed her mind. I'm not sure. I think it was ideological. I think it was just purely ideological. It would not have mattered. And I say that also because I look at someone like James Purcell, very conservative member, born and raised in Warrnambool and Port Fairy, an accountant by trade, absolutely no experience or knowledge around drug use, no personal history of it in his family, yet was entirely supportive. He understood and he got it. So I don't necessarily think that lived experience would have helped Inga at all.
Yeah. Okay, so you've been up to Darlinghurst a few times since the bill's passed. What have you learned up there? What do you see the biggest challenges that are going to face the community centre establishing the supervised injection centre here? And what are the biggest challenges that they've faced up there?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that I'm so pleased that we have that good relationship with the Darlinghurst Centre, and that they have been so successful, and that they have been operating for so long. But it's great to be able to talk to them about what would you do differently, what would and we did this throughout the development of the bill also. As in what would they have preferred if they could have rewritten the legislation? What would they have done? So to collaborate with them throughout this process has been incredibly rewarding. It has resulted in the government agreeing to establish a centre within an existing health centre. So at the Darlinghurst Centre, it's standalone. So if you want to refer someone to primary health to get that ulcer looked at, or to see a psychologist to talk about methadone or whatever it might be, you have to send them at least 500 metres up the road. Where now you're thinking about getting onto methadone, come through this door. It is within the centre. The ability to provide referrals and services to people. And, I know in my personal experience, I have never met someone who is using heroin in the street that wants to continue that lifestyle. That is not a chosen lifestyle. And so if we can provide the compassion and then the tools to help people onto a path of recovery, or onto a path for a slightly better life, then this centre will be better equipped to do it than Sydney. Sydney one of the things is, I know you've been looking at methamphetamine. One of the issues in Victoria is, do we say that some drugs can be used in this centre and some drugs can't? And if you are going to do that, how are you going to do that? Are you going to test them? So setting up, we have to be very careful that we don't set up some very unnecessary barriers that actually could really negatively impact on the centre. And I hope that sensible minds will continue during the process of building the centre. The Sydney Centre also learned about what hours it was good to operate on and what hours it wasn't good to operate on. And so we've learned from that.
What are they?
Well, it's interesting because you're dealing largely with a homeless community. Now, a homeless community that will probably not use at night, sometimes for their own security, that they want to be more alert at night, but they may use during the day. So staying open late at night wasn't actually as necessary as people had first envisaged. So, but opening early in the morning actually was. And that was also to assist some people who may be using but may also be holding down jobs, and that they would be able to come into the centre before that. The relationship with the police was crucial, and that was a slow boil for Darlinghurst. So I think in Richmond, the police will be part of the process they have been part of the process the whole time, but they will be really part of the process in developing what it looks like, what hours it opens, and some of the specific details of the North Richmond Centre. So, yeah, those are the things that we're learning, and we are in constant conversation with the Darlinghurst Centre as well as the Canadians and the Swiss, who have been pioneers and leaders in this area as well.
So you've got a sort of ongoing dialogue with the Canadians and the Swiss in terms of where do we go? Yeah.
So when you look at somewhere like Canada, or particularly in Vancouver, where the other drugs inquiry was late last year, they are losing 4 people are dying from an overdose every day in Vancouver, and in fact in a very small section of Vancouver. They are at this incredible crisis level. So they have actually opening up injecting centres that are not centres at all. They are trestle tables with some lamps, with a box of needles and a bottle of oxygen in a back laneway, and a bunch of volunteers just making sure people are okay. They have now got volunteers, wandering through single unit housing complexes, making sure everyone's okay.
Yeah, with naloxone, and I mean, I guess it's a very different state of affairs in North America to what we have in Australia. I guess, from what I understand, we haven't been hit with fentanyl or carfentanil to any of the same extent as they've sort of been ravaged.
That's right.
North America.
That's right. I think what I took from the Canadian experience was the buy-in from the Vancouver police, but also the fact that keeping someone alive is not that, when they've taken heroin or even fentanyl. If you're there and you've got oxygen, or in the cases of fentanyl and carfentanil, probably naloxone, but in the cases of heroin, really, if you just can give them some oxygen, make sure they're breathing, and make sure you can keep them getting oxygen until they come round, that's all you need. You don't need 17 doctors. You don't need a clinical setting. You don't need any of that. You just need to be able to help people, and peer support and peer-based systems are very effective. We're not up to that politically here, but I think that's certainly something that we should keep an eye on. And when fentanyl and carfentanil come to our shores, when we are seeing our heroin being tainted with fentanyl and carfentanil, when we are seeing those people, due to the prescription monitoring system, being knocked off their opioid prescription and are seeking black market opioids.
Do you think that's inevitable?
Absolutely. We have I think we have managed our we have managed our prescription of opioids slightly better than North America, or probably much better. However, this year we start, 1st of February, we start a prescription monitoring system in Victoria, and that will pick up the people who are being overprescribed, the people who are or do have an addiction to OxyContin. Now, hopefully we will have the measures to help to assist those people so they don't end up in the black market. But
which is an interesting one. I'm not sure if you know Suzanne Nielsen. She's part of the centre up at UNSW.
Right.
That works on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest barriers she was saying for this is that a lot of the assistance for addicts is not geared towards those people that have developed prescription opioid problems. So things like the MSIC are not really, they don't at all cater to... No,
that's right. That's right. And that's absolutely the case. And I think we will be needing to prepare doctors and health centres in a very different way for how to treat drug use and drug misuse.
Can I ask you now, just if you're able to, just describe what kind of staff, what kind of roster will be working in the centre when it's operating? if you can describe sort of what it'll be. What is the journey of someone that goes through the doors?
Yeah. So broadly, we don't know the exact hours of operation and numbers of people there, but we expect we'll be seeing a couple of hundred people, well, probably around 300 injections a day at the centre. That would be an estimate. And what would happen is a person will come in. If it's their first time visiting the centre, they will register, just so you've got some basic details. Wouldn't necessarily be disclosing actual names and addresses, but some basic information, a basic health check at that point. They would then move from that reception area to the supervision area, where they will be provided with clean drug use paraphernalia, whether that's spoons or needles or water, swabs, whatever's required, tourniquets, etc. There they will be monitored, and in that experience, not only will be people keeping an eye on them, but also if you start seeing people who've got serious ulcers, who have got serious issues there, then some people may be able to also help them in a very basic primary health situation that just possibly helping them to show them how to use a needle safely. But then after they have used, they would move to into another space. Now, in some areas, that space is the same space as the entry, so you come in and out of the same area. This centre, we would probably following the New South Wales program, it might be a different exit. So there'll be a recovery room, tea and coffee, but that's where you'll have social workers, peer educators, psychologists, and people having a chat and just checking in with people. This is not you have to undertake a lecture on the evils of drugs. This is how you're going, what's happening in your life. And really, this is, social work 101, just showing that you care about someone, and that someone, and for someone who possibly hasn't had anyone caring for them for a long time, that is probably going to be one of the most important roles that the centre will play.
Yeah, certainly. So just specifically on you now, what is your role between now and when we open?
My role is largely to remain as an advocate, as largely to ensure that the funding comes at the time it's needed, to ensure that the process isn't hampered by public servants and report writing, to ensure that this all happens in a timely way, and that we get the centre, that we get the money, that it is allowed to open, and that we get a system that reviews it and reports on the effectiveness of it. This will also enable us to improve that centre and respond to emerging trends, whether that be the introduction of fentanyl. Certainly in Sydney, people are coming in with fentanyl patches, scraping them off and injecting them. So that's already happening. But yeah, it will be my role will just to be there to ensure that things are moving along smoothly. I don't think there's any reason why they won't. However, best laid plans.
Yeah. And so you've got the trial period, and then I guess with any trial period anywhere, you've got to have a certain KPIs or sort of.
That's right.
What do you have to? Is there any benchmarks or things you have to prove or show by the end of that period for this to carry on?
Yep. Look, I would hope, and certainly we saw this in New South Wales, but I think the way that we are responding to this with a basically a committee that will be overseeing this right from the word go and providing that oversight, I would expect us to see a reduction, most definitely in overdose deaths in the area, but I would hope that we would also see a reduction in ambulance call-outs in the area, because you might save someone from an overdose, but if their brain has not had oxygen for 3 or 4 minutes, these are lasting effects of that overdose. So I would hope we'd see a reduction in ambulance call-outs, obviously a reduction in overdose deaths. We would see a change to the amenity of the area. You've got open drug use on many of the streets in that area. The drug paraphernalia that is left in the streets is also a problem for the community. So I hope that we would see less open drug use and we would see less discarded syringes and needles in the area. Those are the objectives. And one of the other KPIs obviously will be pathways to recovery. So, out of that cohort of 300 or 400 people, did any of them move towards treatment? And if they did, how successful was it? And I think that will also possibly assist us in developing better treatment models.
Yeah, 100%. What kind of role has Minister Foley played so far in?
Minister Foley has been a great advocate for this centre, and without probably being able to name them, there has been a number of great advocates within the government and within the cabinet who, if we hadn't had their voices also, we would not have achieved this. So Minister Foley, and it will be his office that oversees this, but they are entirely invested in this. So, and they have been, and I think that will ensure that we will see this happen in an effective and a timely way. That they are really invested in this. They believe in it. They support the notion. And we've got the police association supporting. There is no one who is going to provide roadblocks to this particularly, or no one that can provide an effective roadblock at this stage.
Well, that answers my next question. I'm just interested, you just said then that there are a number of ministers that supported it without naming them. Is that because you didn't just want to go through a list, or are there things from stopping you actually?
Yeah, I think it's they didn't come out. They spoke to me privately, and I would respect the fact that they spoke to me privately. Look, now that it's past the caucus and that it's Labor policy, every minister supports it. But yeah, so prior to that being the case, the private support was greatly appreciated and was helpful.
Yeah, hugely important, I imagine. Okay, so we've only got 10 minutes left. What I might just do, and I'm sorry to do this because I know it's annoying, but just that first 6 or 7 minutes when this
sure.
Up, I just might go over the same questions so we have
no problem.
The good audio, because there's nothing worse than getting back to the studio and knowing.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so just again, if you can tell me why having this centre is so important, why you put so much energy into advocating for it over the last...
Yeah, I went to, this was a supervised injecting centre was something that when we formed the Sex Party, it was one of our first drug reform policies. So it was something that I went into this parliament wanting to achieve. But when you saw the statistics of the growing overdose deaths in Victoria, but specifically in North Richmond, this just became more and more crucial. And I think the tragic death of Miss A, who was a 32-year-old mother of 3, really put that in perspective of how important it was.
And you told me earlier before we did this that you have a personal connection for when you were living up in Darlinghurst. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Look, I've obviously, I worked on a needle exchange bus, and I've had friends, and in fact an ex-boyfriend who died from a heroin overdose. I've had friends who've become addicted to heroin and other substances. I've had family members who have been addicted to heroin and other substances, and sadly for some of them, they didn't make it through to the other end, and that was mainly because there was no one there to supervise and support them. Fortunately for some of my family, they've survived that and come out the other end, and which is brilliant. But yeah, I've had personal experiences, and I think more and more people probably do know someone who has lost someone to drug addiction.
Do you feel as though in your life, if there had been services like this available?
Oh, I know that. Well, I don't know. Sorry, I feel that if that service had been around when we knew that they needed to be around, which was back in the 1980s, we started talking about this. It took 10 years to get one opened in Sydney, and then it took another nearly 20 years to get one opened up in Victoria. But I know that we would have saved hundreds and hundreds of lives had those centres been opened up back when the first initial pushes for them were made. I know that there's colleagues of mine that would probably be alive today, and I have met over this period and in former jobs that I've had so many family members that have lost a child at their cusp of adulthood, and that the pain of losing a child never goes away, and it's palpable, that pain 10, 20 years later. So if we can prevent that pain for another family, then that's a pretty amazing thing.
When you say colleagues, was this when you were working at the Needle Exchange?
Yep. Well, I was a volunteer at the Needle Exchange. I was at the AIDS Council. So this was when governments were brave. This was when the governments of Australia and our state governments went, you know what, we need to try and keep people alive. We need to stop HIV in its tracks, which was largely what it was about back in the 80s and early 90s. It was around HIV. So, yeah, back then we were brave. But also we were starting to see an incredibly pure sort of heroin coming in those late 90s, and we were seeing enormous deaths, and there is no reason to think that history will not repeat itself.
How much frustration then do you bring to the table when you're talking about, when you're someone that's had a personal connection to things maybe being different back then, if there were the services available, and we were, like you say, carrying on with the courageous line that was being taken back then? How then frustrating is it sitting at the table knowing that if this hadn't taken so long, it could have saved the lives of people but also people within a community
That's
that
right.
you were involved quite heavily in?
Look, it frustrates me enormously, but I also I bear a thought for the campaigners back in the 90s in Victoria, who in the election between Bracks and Kennett, the Kennett government said, if we're elected, we'll open one. The Bracks government said, if we're elected, we'll open 5. And then nothing happened, and more people died. The frustration of the Dr. Alex Wodaks, the Robert Richters, the David Stanleys of this world, mine is just a smidge to what theirs is. But also, I wonder where we would be on drug policy if things like supervised injecting centres were 20 years old and we thought, yes, well, that's how you save someone's life. You treat it as a health issue. Maybe we would be a lot more advanced in a lot of other areas of drug law reform, whether that would be things like heroin prescriptions or the legalisation of other drugs.
Yeah, it's...
What if?
Well, it does. Yeah, I was going to say it's a difficult one to dwell on the possibilities of what could have been. Okay, look, that's pretty much all I have.
Fantastic.
I think that wraps us up. 5 minutes before we were supposed to.
Great.
Hang on 1 second. I guess the last one I just didn't ask you, is there any, or did you have many conversations behind closed doors with Premier Andrews specifically, or was it something that you go to the ministers for?
Yeah, I had conversations with the Premier, but I also had conversations with other ministers, with other senior members of the party, and then, started pulling in every favour that I could find with every organisation that I could find, and for them to also advocate for this, which people did in a second. So when the Australian Drug Foundation goes and talks to the Premier, when the head of the AMA goes and talks to the Premier, when the head of the firefighters or the ambulances talks to the Premier, I think those conversations were also incredibly effective.
So, and this is the last question, it was I'm kind of getting two things as well.
Yeah.
It was a combination of overwhelming support and evidence from all these amazingly reputable organisations, groups of people, but it also seems like there were these very strong personal stories that
That's right.
you mentioned before that may have also had a role in changing the government's view on this. Was it a combination of both of those things?
It was, and I think that passion that people have from a lived experience really gives people drive to affect change. But really, the job was to bring people with us. So to bring that body of support was so crucial to winning this. So we could not have done that without the support of as many people as of a wide group of people. So to bring, strategically, that's the thing you want to do. You want to bring in the community. You want to bring in the experts. You want to bring in, ex-premiers if you can, anyone of influence. You want to bring in to be part of your campaign. And I think we did that very effectively this time.
And I know I said that was the last question, but this is actually the last question. What's your next step? It's a big victory, I think, for you guys that have worked on this. It was your private members bill that got it rolling. What's the next thing you're looking at?
Well, this, as I think I mentioned sometime earlier, I saw this as part of a bigger picture into looking at drug law reform, obviously. So I've got a drugs inquiry that I initiated that's a very broad-based inquiry, and that has been trying not to reinvent the wheel. So looking at drug laws that work in other jurisdictions. And we will be reporting in March, and I would hope to be advocating for the recommendations of that report to be implemented, or to at least start the ball rolling in a much broader drug law reform policy for Victoria, plus a whole range of other areas of policy, plus get re-elected.
Fiona Patten, you've got a lot on your plate. I might just get you quickly before we shut off.
Yeah.
I know we're doing this backwards, but just to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Fiona Patten. I'm a Member of Parliament and I represent the Northern Metropolitan Region, and I am the leader of the Australian Reason Party.
Thank you very much.